And this was a white man, right? White, Jewish, right? Who arrived in Louisiana midway through the Civil War period. His DNA results, in fact, revealed that he was 7% Ashkenazi Jew or Jewish. Now, Gumbel was shocked to learn that he was ancestrally both German and Jewish. Just imagine, this is a man that operates in the world of the media, where there are lots of very high-profile Jewish people, right, involved in that world, in that industry. He's rubbing shoulders with them every day, but he has no idea that they could very well be his own cousins. Interesting. Now, Bryant, who is 73, his second great-grandfather probably was born around the 1800s. And the period of the 1650s up until about the 1850s, a good 200 years roughly, seems to be the time frame when Jews and people of African descent, mostly coming from slavery, would have intermingled and produced offspring. In this case, actually, if you go back, Jewish offspring. Now, we're not going to really dig into the whole halakhic points that the State of Israel lays out, or the Orthodox rabbis would lay out for who is halakhically Jewish. Even that's somewhat debatable, at least in my opinion. Because if you go back in biblical times, who God referred to as actually being a descendant of Abraham and actually Jewish is somewhat different than where we are today. And maybe that's for good reason, because if you just said everybody and anybody was Jewish, then, of course, all kinds of people who actually technically aren't Jewish would be flooding into Israel. With what proof? Because we've only had DNA evidence of these things for the last roughly 10 years, 15 years, maybe, right? You could go and take a DNA test. So before that, it was a lot of just records and hearsay. You said, she said, grandma said, right? So things are a little bit different today. But so those are some of the reasons for that. But if we take the rough definition that if my grandfather was Jewish, then maybe I'm not halakhically Jewish, but I'm still a bit Jewish. And that is a key point, and a key point of this show and where we're going and where this is hopefully helpful, right? And part of this show being a Messianic Jewish show, because we're, as well as being focused on just the ancestry discussion itself, we're also focused on the journey back from a biblical standpoint to the Jewish patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. If you can say that your grandparent, great-grandparent, great-great-grandparent, or go 10 generations back, if you could point to an ancestor, then you have a trail back to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Now, for some people, that is completely unimportant. But for maybe a few of you, maybe people who go to church, maybe people who go to synagogue, maybe even people that go to mosque, since we have a common forefather in Abraham, maybe this information is important to you. And so, again, that is a key focus of the show, right? Should that be important? Is it important? In my opinion, and for my purposes, it's the most important thing. You know, if you're a Jewish person, or if you're a descendant of Abraham, descendant of Isaac, a descendant of Jacob, and you don't embrace what God has given in the Torah, in the Bible, and so on, then it's a little kind of wasted. Okay? So we'll leave it there for now. But this is a key important point. Back to Bryant Gumbel. So, again, he would be one of these African-American Jewish descendants of the tribes of Israel, of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And one little side point here is for listeners that this may intersect with, or you may have this particular situation that Mr. Gumbel has. It's pretty unknown around most Jewish circles that there were actually quite a few Jews in the 1600s, 1700s, 1800s that owned not a lot, generally speaking, but they would have a few male and female slaves. Okay, just is what it is. Maybe 2, 3, 4, 5, something like that, or a little bit more, which we'll get into as we go along. There'll be shows I will talk about just this subject alone. It's a very interesting and important subject. But and these are names like Levi, again, Moses, Cohen. A lot of this information actually is very public. It's just one of these things that doesn't get talked about because we don't generally think of Jews as being from the South. We generally think of Jews from the European migration of German and Russian Jews to the United States roughly in the later 1800s. And mostly they immigrate to places like New York and New Jersey, Massachusetts, and so on. But there was quite a substantial migration of Jewish people to the United States in the South in the days of slavery. And very often that was just because, they were attempting to gain economic advantage, make money, establish themselves here in the U.S. And, again, it's a very complicated subject. They had to do, in some cases, what, not to make excuses, but, what the locals did. So if you were in South Carolina, and that's a very prominent location, is the area of Charleston, South Carolina. In fact, there's a synagogue that was actually built by Jewish people coming into the United States there. And it was actually built by the slaves of those Jewish people. And it's still there in South Carolina today. In fact, there are a number of them. There are up and down the East Coast, from South Carolina all the way up almost to New York itself. And probably even in New York and Rhode Island. Right, the very, very famous Touro synagogue in Rhode Island. So the point here is that you should understand, right, if you're coming from the African American perspective and ancestry perspective, don't believe that you can't have Jewish ancestry. Not for a second. In fact, I have many, 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 many DNA cousins of African descent that also have Jewish ancestry. Per Ancestry.com. Okay? So again, this is the case for Bryant Gumbel. It's the case for many other African Americans, and my own family is not an exception. Okay? So again, lots of people have been cut off, either from a European standpoint, from an African standpoint, or a Spanish standpoint, which we'll also get into, right? Again, I'm going to underscore this point. The Spanish or Sephardic example, which is actually the case with many of these early American Jews, they're actually of Sephardic descent and not of Ashkenazi European descent. So it makes it much more difficult to identify and make the case that these were Jewish ancestors. Because I've made this point, the DNA tests that we commonly use do not test for this ancestry in your DNA. So very confusing, very complicated. Hopefully I made that relatively clear. But in Bryant Gumbel's case, his ancestor was actually of European descent, or at least that's what we know. He could have been a mix. Very often, Jews in New Orleans, you would have an Ashkenazi Jew and a Sephardic Jew, and you would have both. So all we know is his his second great grandfather. We didn't go any farther back, or Dr. Gates didn't go any farther back than that. So there's lots more information that could be found there. And so we're really just at the tip of the iceberg when we say his second great grandfather and what his ancestry may have been. So, point here is that for people like Bryant Gumbel, as well as his brother, as well as many other African American, Spanish Americans, right? Latinos, and so on, this information can be hidden, even in a kind of a deeper level, and more difficult to find than our European cousins for various different reasons. Also, I should point out, obviously, if you came from Ireland or England and those sorts of places, as well as parts of South America, the detail of record keeping can be more extensive. And so if you really start looking, it can be somewhat easier to find than if we're talking about, a person of slave descent living in the South and in some cases being cut off from the primary family that you're intersecting with in the U.S. So moving on back over to Mr. Martin, right? His name alone can be an indication, even though that's probably not where the Jewishness is intersecting. But names, as I want to point out here in this first broadcast, are very, very important. And names alone can take you down the path of finding your Jewish ancestry. So the name Martin can come from a number of different places. It could be Jewish. It could be not Jewish. It could be sound like Martin in the U.S., but actually have originated in Spain and have been Martinez, or just Martin, or if it goes over to Italy, it can be Martinelli, and so on and so forth, right? These names morph, they change depending on where you live and so on, right? Just as they do in the United States. As you know, many Jewish names have been Americanized, or Russian names have been Americanized, or French names even have been Americanized once people land on our shores, okay? So Mr. Martin's family, we do know, came from Ireland. Now, you might think there are not many Jews in Ireland, but actually this is untrue. Whether we're talking about Ireland or Scotland